is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
A power-sharing deal has been signed in Khartoum, and Sudan has put the political crisis behind it, at least for now. While the pact has put together an 11-member sovereign council in which the military and civilians will jointly steer the country during a 3-year transition period. Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah Abdel Rahman Burhan will head the transitional council, while Abdallah Hamdok, a former UN economist, has been appointed Prime Minister. Celebrations broke out across the North African country as news of the deal filtered through, and heads of state and other dignitaries gathered in Khartoum to witness the swearing-in of the new leaders. But with a sanctions-hit economy and months of political uncertainty, will Sudan's transitional agreement finally pave the way to lasting peace? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Sudan's new Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok has now called for the establishment of a vibrant democracy, saying that achieving peace and solving the economic crisis will be top priorities. We'll go to our panel in just a moment, but first, let's have a look at how the appointment of the seasoned diplomat has been met in Sudan.
The swearing-in of Sudan's new Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok and other council members is seen as a further step in transition towards civilian rule.
شعار الثورة العميق.
The revolution's deep-rooted slogan, freedom, peace and justice, will form the program of the transitional period. Allow me to accomplish the central demands. The number one priority is to stop the war and build permanent peace. We are working to alleviate the suffering of our people in refugee camps. Stopping the war will also depend on resolving the dire economic crisis and building a national economy based on productivity and not on blessings and donations.
في معسكرات اللجوء.
Hamdok's appointment comes as the outgoing head of the military council, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, was sworn in as a leader of the new sovereign council. The body will run the country for 3 years until an election after decades of autocratic rule. It replaces the transitional military council that took charge after months of deadly street protests brought down the Islamist ruler in April. The new rulers, however, have the in tray full. It includes pushing for the lifting of the country's suspension from the African Union and from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism.
We are very happy today. It is now time to remove the black clothes from our body because we were in sadness, and now we are going to change our clothes and our life is going to change.
From the beginning of the revolution, we thank God, and we are hoping that from today the civilian government will implement our demands, and with this happiness, we still remember our fallen heroes.
The other daunting challenges that await the rulers include reviving the economy and unifying a country still plagued by unrest in regions. Chamgono, CGTN.
And it is indeed a historic moment for Sudan. And joining me to discuss the latest on Sudan, Sarah Kira is joining me from Cairo. She's a political analyst and director of the European North Africa Center for Research. With me in studio, Matthias Muindi. He's an independent political risk analyst specializing on the Horn of Africa and Great Lakes region. And John Gashia, a veteran journalist and expert on Sudan affairs. Thank you all for joining in on the program. Sarah Kira, let me start off with you in Cairo as you're watching all these events unfold. Egypt has been a key player in Sudan's transition. Now, Sudan has a power-sharing deal that is expected to restore order and pave the way for elections. It will have both the military and protest leaders, jointly leading the country through a sovereign council. What does that deal mean, though? Give us a breakdown.
Hello, thank you for having me. Well, the deal is kind of historic for Sudan because it's a pavement for the way for rebuilding Sudan again, economically and politically. The deal was brokered as a conflict resolution and an approach for political and economic reformation in Sudan. Along the democratic movement, along with the Supreme Military Council in Sudan, have agreed to share power and rebuild their country, along with, of course, appointing some economic reformation. This is like a saving of the status quo of Sudan. This was through a constitutional agreement or a constitutional declaration joined between civilian power and military power. And this is historic because it's for the first time in Sudan, the civilian and the military power, both powers share power to lead their country.
All right, Matthias, you've been watching this from the Horn of Africa region, and as Sarah points out, it is a historic moment for Sudan. Exactly how remarkable is this for Sudan, and how exactly is this going to happen, though, sharing power between the military and the civilian, because as it is being pointed out, it is the first time ever.
It is very historic, considering that this is the first time in 30 years you have former opposition people who have been opposing the previous regime of Bashir now in government. And it's also the first time we are seeing the military and the civilians sharing power, possibly in the last 30 years. But it's not unprecedented in Sudan, because we have had previous episodes whereby civilians have been involved in government. But this is the first one in modern times. And it gives the political players in Sudan, whether they are the ones allied to the military or the ones allied to the civilians, a chance to maybe set the country on a framework of political and economic reform.
Right, but John, watching this though, and you've been quite involved in South Sudan's affairs and South Sudan's agreements though, and you're looking at what is unfolding in Sudan. How are you reading the mood at the moment there?
Yeah, thank you, Beatrice. My own reading is that this is an experiment. It's a very important experiment, but should something go wrong, should therefore the parties to the agreement, both the military and also the civilians, and remember the military has its own factions, the civilians have their own factions, so it's really you're bringing in very desperate, very competitive groups with only one thing in common: to share power. They also have their own agenda. So I am optimistic and cautiously that it will hold, because if it does, this will be revolutionary.
Matthias, General Mohamed Delgado, though, one of the powerful military figures, though, has said that he's stressing on the commitment of the power-sharing deal, and that the military will adhere to the letter of the agreement. Well, Sarah is both optimistic and pessimistic. Are you optimistic, though, that the parties to the deal can't stick to their side of the bargain?
I think they are going to stick to this agreement, because when you look at what each one has gained from this arrangement, they seem to be portraying themselves as the victor. When you look at the Transitional Military Council, they have seen this arrangement continues to give them a presence in any transitional arrangement you are going to have in Sudan. So it's something like self-preservation for the security forces in Sudan. And when you look at the opposition civilian movement, they think the revolution has succeeded. So it will be in their best interest that they stick to this agreement. Now, the problem will come when they start implementing this agreement, because like David pointed out, there are very, very different interests which put them into this ship together. And factions which are allied to the military, they have been around for a very long time in government. They have survived international isolation under Bashir when the government was being sanctioned by the West. So there are people who are used to playing in the long run. So they will see that they'll try to claw back as much power they lost during the revolution as much as they can. On the other hand, the civilian movement understands that this is an opportunity which they cannot let go. Right. Because when you look at the history of civilian administrations in Sudan, it's not all that, impressive. They have always been in power. They mess up things, and then the army comes back. So they don't want to see a repeat of that. So it's an agreement which I suspect, much as it's a long transitional period of 39 months, I see it going, lasting that period. It's a question of what are we going to see at the end of those 39 months.
Before we get to the question of implementation, which is always quite a tricky part, John, I do want to get your thoughts on that, though. I mean, are you confident, given the fact that you've been following South Sudan with all their problems, are you confident that the parties to the Sudan, deal will stick to their part of the bargain?
As I said, Beatrice, I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'm perhaps not a doomsayer, because what we have here is a coming together of very desperate groups that don't want to lose any action. And they are bringing onto the table certain deals where they think their best interests will be served while they buy time. And perhaps, Beatrice, we needed to look at the role of the different international and regional players. In this instance, we have Egypt, we have Ethiopia, we have certainly the East African region, and the larger international community on the fight against radicalization and the fight about terrorism and all this. So I think all these 4 disparate groups have been under a lot of pressure to kind of strike a deal, to buy time, and perhaps, hopefully, that they will slowly get to accept and strike deals. Will this work? I hope it would, because, as my colleague is saying, for Sudan, this would be revolutionary. I think all the parties are willing to concede while they prepare and buy time. I think it will be a lot of mediation, and I will say this, the Gulf Arab states, Egypt, the international community, and even the region would really have to be very careful in how they walk the different parties to the peace process. Am I optimistic? Yes, and I hope for Sudan that this will be a deal maker, not a deal breaker.
Sarah, Egypt has been very key in this mediation process. The Arab League as well has been very key in terms of implementation and ensuring that the timelines are going to be adhered to by both parties, the civilian and the military leaders, though. Who will be responsible in ensuring that the timelines are adhered to? Who will be responsible in ensuring that Sudan's power deal stays put?
Arab League and the African Union are very positive about what's going on in Sudan now, especially that they have a technocratic government, especially that it didn't take much time like what happened in the Arab Springs, and let's say as well that the political turmoil in Sudan, it was severe, but it didn't take a lot of time. It started December 2018, and today we're witnessing in few months a resolution. So for the first time, an African dispute, an African problem is resolved inside Africa and inside the region. The best out of that declaration is that none of the 11 members are allowed to run for elections. So they will be working for the good of Sudan out of goodwill, not for any political aspiration in 3 years, and that's a very good point on the declarations.
Matthias, the key question of implementation is always the sticky part. Once the deal has been hammered out, then the implementation phase becomes a tricky portion. Do you see the responsibility that has been given to the Sovereign Council, or the responsibility that has been given to other parties, the African Union, the Arab League, Ethiopia in particular? Are they going to be sufficient, though, to ensure that Sudan's journey comes to fruition?
This is one agreement which was basically mediated by the African Union. So the African Union has already staked its credibility on that. And Ethiopia was working on behalf of the regional IGAD organization. So IGAD and the African Union would want this agreement to work. But the problem will start when you start looking at the detail of what is it that they have to start implementing. Because the agreement calls for things like, for example, investigations of abuses which have been perpetrated by the Bashir regime. if you had to carry out independent investigations into what has happened in Sudan in the last 30 years, including the protest movement, you are basically going to scatter this government because you are basically going to target the people who signed it. On the other hand, when you look at the economic issues which confront Sudan at the moment and in the last couple of years, most of them are tied up with people with the Bashir administration. So the opposition matches they are going to be in charge of economic reform will have to go and talk to people basically they are opposed to. So they'll have to see how much concessions can we get out from the older regime and how much reform can we carry out. Now, if you carry out limited reforms, it's going to upset people who put you in power, the protest movement, because if you remember, the uprising started with economic issues.
Right.
And if those are not addressed, we might basically be back to where we were like within 3 years from now, if not earlier than that. So the reforms will depend on how much the military generals are willing to give up in terms of things like security reforms, things like investigations of abuses, and how much economic reforms they want. On the other hand, the protest movement or the civilians in this government will have to start managing the expectations of their supporters because they started by saying that all the Bashir people should be out of office. What they have ended up is less than what they were demanding. So they'll have to start managing those expectations, and the earlier the better.
All right, and we will look at Sudan's peace journey or the unity of Sudan when we return from the break. We are going to take a short break now. When we come back, we'll take another closer look at what lies ahead for Sudan. Stay tuned.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue our discussion. Still with me from Cairo, Sarah Kira, and in studio with me, John Gashie and Matthias Mwindi. Sarah, the whole question of unity of Sudan, Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok has talked about unifying the country and bringing the country back from its economic crisis. In terms of unifying the country and peace for the country, after 9 months of protest, how key is this going to be?
The country needs political, economic stability, it needs change, and it needs a consensus between all the powers there, especially on the figures who will handle the ministerial top jobs. And they need sustainable peace and very steep and strong steps on economic reformation, because that was the main reason behind the turmoil in Sudan. And that was the biggest failure of al-Bashir's policies. We need as well, one of the very important topics as prioritized by the Sudanese technocrat government is peace in different regions in Sudan as well. So along with peace, political stability and economic reformation, these are not easy topics to start with in Sudan.
Right, Matthias.
When you look at Prime Minister Hamdoun, he has a lot of serious challenges coming up. Let's look at the economic issues. The West, which was basically behind the protest movement, has not put its money where its mouth is at the moment. During the protest, some of the Gulf powers, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, managed to give $3 billion to the military junta by that time. So you can see the military section of the administration seems to have a source of where they could get finances if we were to get these economic reforms to get in place. The Prime Minister has come with, glowing praise over his role in the UN. He has now to reach out those people in the West. And it's a question of how much is the West prepared to give to maybe alleviate the economic issues in Sudan so that we don't get back to another protest environment. On the other hand, the Prime Minister is also expected to reconcile and maybe the unite a country. That's a very good expectation and objective to achieve. But the problem is when you look at the people who have put him in office, they have already disagreed with the armed movements in Sudan. The armed movements, yes, they are part of the protest movement, but they have not got, they have not got a seat on the table. So they are still very angry. It's now a question of, are they going to be willing to negotiate with the public face of an organization which has put them out of power? That's going to be a very tall order for him, because this is a technocratic government. And in Sudan, technocratic governments have always tended to struggle against the various factions you find in the country, whether it's in the security forces or whether it's in the traditional political movements, especially the ones rooted in Islamist ideology.
Let's look at that economic aspect first in terms of prioritizing the economy, because Sudan's economy has been in a crisis now for a while. It is part of the reason that most people went to the streets as a result of the economic downturn and subsidies and it being removed and so forth. So how can Sudan's economy, though, be fixed in the immediate?
There are very deep structural problems with the economy in Sudan, both on a microeconomic and a microeconomic level. And in terms of those reforms, those are not issues that the Prime Minister is going to solve in the next 1 year. He has now to figure out what are going to be the quick wins for me here in terms of, let's say, getting things like shortage of currency sorted out, shortage of some of the basic goods sorted out. If he can start getting that one done within the next couple of months, he can start easing some of the financial frustrations among the civilians who used that one to go to the streets. The bigger problems will be now the macroeconomic reforms. Right. Those ones go to into the Sudanese economy, which has been in problems for almost more than 30, 40 years. He has to really work with a lot of forces inside and outside the country to see whether they can come up with something which is acceptable. Sudan has one of the largest foreign external debts in the world, almost $52 billion. The economy is not really performing. You can't get, the country can't get access to international credit. So there are so many structural issues. He has to, first of all, deal internally, and then he has to go to the international market, whether it's the IMF, the World Bank, and let's say the bilateral donors in the West, to see how they could be of help. But of immediate concern for him, he has to sort out the day-to-day things which affect the people, because if he doesn't sort those ones out, like access to, currency, access to money in the banks, he's going to get into big problems with the people who put him in office.
But John, and there are lessons here, though, that Africa has had to learn, given the nature of the African Union's intervention. What kind of lessons are those, though, that African countries have learned in terms of dealing with the crisis? Is this now a situation of African solutions to African problems, leaving the African continent to deal with its own solutions?
I would say that Sudan is very critical, but can Africa deliver? I think everybody is hoping that they can. There is a political will. But we have also got to understand the various interests at play. It's okay to talk about the international community worried about Sudan. It's also talking about, but remember the bilateral strategic interests at play in Sudan. For Egypt, a stable Sudan because of the Nile waters, and the backyard, because there are a lot of long-standing issues. For Egypt, a stable Sudan because of the spillover from Libya. But Sudan as it is now, straddles what we call the this sub-Saharan Africa zone, area that stretches from northern Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and what have you. But then we have a very interesting two countries on the side. We have Eritrea and we have Ethiopia. And then we have the role of Sudan in the Gulf, in the Yemen, in Syria. Sudan, to a large extent, by having 2 feet, both African and Arab, So less and that perhaps using where Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries are coming in to help. So there are so many vested strategic, economic, military interests at play in Sudan, led by Egypt to the north, the Gulf Arab, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, Abu Dhabi and what have you, to the east, and Americas to the other, and then South Sudan.
If Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok was to look inward, to look to his own resources, given the fact that oil revenues are not what they used to be, which sectors would he be looking at?
The big, after the secession of South Sudan in 2011, Sudan has turned to gold mining as the biggest source of government revenue, and also it has also turned into the agricultural sector. But gold mining has been the key source of finances for the government. The problem with the Sudanese gold sector or gold mining sector is that most of the mines are in conflict zones.
Right.
That's number one. So the government armed forces are being forced to go and protect gold mines to ensure that this economic activity continues on. So that means that the Prime Minister will have to rely very much on the security forces to ensure this economic activity continues.
Right, so I do want to get a final comment from all of you, and Sarah, to you first though. Having heard all the sentiments in this program, has Sudan now turned a new chapter?
It's too early to say if Sudan has closed any chapter or not yet. The upcoming 3 years are very critical on Sudan, and let's hope they pull it off and achieve all of their people's aspirations.
Right. Matthias, has Sudan turned a new chapter?
Like Sarah says, it's too early to say at the moment, because when you look at the peace agreement, it's still fragile. But the good thing which has come out of it, it has managed to diffuse some of the tensions which had been going on for the last 9 months. So if they can build on that, they could possibly get some reforms, whether it's economic or political reforms during the transition period. But the larger, deeper structural issues and problems in Sudan will require a longer period than 39 months.
All right, John, your final thoughts.
There is the older Sudanese political class. They have not told us a thing about this. I'm talking about El Mahdi. I'm talking about El Mirgani. And they still exercise a lot of influence, as what my colleague here was talking about. There are the Islamist issues, the old political parties and establishment. They have not said a thing. Will they support this? I hope so.
All right, gentlemen, and Sarah Kira, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much for your insights on Sudan. And that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. Thank you to my panel of experts. Sarah Kira from Cairo, she's a political analyst and director of the European North Africa Center for Research. And in studio, Matthias Muindi, he's an independent political risk analyst specializing on the Horn of Africa and Great Lakes region. And John Gashie, veteran journalist and expert on Sudan affairs. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback, and do keep the conversation going online through our social media handles and on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Until next time, goodbye.